is MS Office Hours. Today is January 3rd, 2019, and Micah Linehan is going to walk us through how to get started with Azure Information Protection. Thanks, Micah.
Yeah, thanks, Preston. So today when we kind of get started, foundationally, actually, I'll jokingly say, I tried to whiteboard this for a couple institutions over the past few weeks, and man, it definitely, there's a lot of arrows all over the place. So hopefully as we start working through this being the first segment of a few other ones, it's important to understand this is our baseline. This is where we go in and we activate the Azure Information Protection, and we get started with a unified policy across the Office 365 environment and ultimately into other applications outside of the Microsoft suite of products, depending on kind of where you're at and what products you have to use. Really going to focus on not trying to label what's the difference between P1, P2. I want to show you what's possible, where do we get started, how do we work with these individual components. The one counterpoint that I would actually say, and as we get started with this, is portal.azure.com is an extremely important one for the Azure Information Protection, at least the last time that I double checked. If I went into the admin center here and launched that as I wait for it to load, and clicked on the Azure AD side, it'll actually launch it into a different one where it says aad.portal.azure.com. This is a simplified blade, and ultimately I don't have the search parameters to be able to pull up Azure Information Protection. So if I want to go in and switch over, really what I have to do is just simply delete the Azure Active Directory side of it. And now I have the capability to search for, and as I completely break the blade instance there, but I can search for Azure Information Protection. In the other version, when I actually have the Azure Active Directory side, it does not display that search. It won't pull up the AIP side. It's a little funky, but Azure Information Protection is a core component in our EMS suite and capabilities. And what we're really going to work through today is just understanding labeling policy, kind of a quick demonstration on how to set up and build a policy, look at it, have it look at individual protection components, classification sets here. So the first thing that I'm going to start, I'm going to actually switch, instead of just going right into labeling, I'm going to go to policies here. The reason I start here is this is kind of your scoping, right? Whenever we look at defining these policies or defining protection controls, who do we want to basically curb this content for, or who does a policy apply to, right? As I create labels, maybe I have one that's specific to the health science center or to engineering that has different labels based on specific projects that they have and what have you. This is where I'm going to go ahead and create a new policy. So I can create a policy name and just call it, example, engineering side. I can go ahead and select and scope the groups that I have here based on, if I've built out a dynamic group or anything else, a mail-enabled security group. My demo lab's not going to pull that up, but you kind of get the point. The groups are a very common construct that we have and what we use for scoping and distributing content, not just from a security standpoint, but from notification and ultimately an application access side. So I can go ahead here and within this policy, you see the labels that are here. I can go ahead and add and remove more of them. But if I want to actually start looking at, curbing it to a different audience, saying, okay, I have all of these labels, and we'll get into the labels here in a minute. But if I have all these labels, do I want to enforce? So say your general population, your students, you're not, in most cases, you're not going to make them provide a label or define the content as either personal, public, or general. But say the health science center you do, or engineering, I can actually go ahead and here and basically define that it has to be automatically applied or a user set in order for people to work in this environment. So you can make it kind of your default being public or personal, and then when we get into the labeling side, I'll show you what the classifications look like and how we handle those controls. But you can enforce it to always be labeled. And this, as we work forward in further contextual presentations, you're going to end up in a situation where I've forced all this content to be classified. Now I'm going to go ahead and say, here's a records request, or here's a DLP lookup, or an advanced e-discovery, where I need to filter out anything that's been flagged as personal, or anything that is flagged as highly confidential needs to be reviewed, and we kind of move from there. There's a lot more things coming down the road that we can do based upon this, but these are those foundational building blocks. So we can go here. Okay. Yep.
Micah, just real quick, make sure that I'm clarifying this. What you're saying is they can build a separate policy for students versus, say, somebody in a financial services department, so they can get started using labeling and classification just with, say, staff members and avoid impacting students at all from this enforcement. Right?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. We could go in here as I kind of walk through this. There's a bunch of other ones really, really nice here. I don't know if you guys have seen this. The new clients of Outlook and Outlook on the web have a do not forward button, which is just a simple information protection engine that, similar to what we used to have as a kind of that S-MIME, or that encryption in the Exchange Online protection controls. Really simple one there that actually will add another policy in. If we hit save here, you can actually also then allow people to customize these permission controls if you want to. I don't see a lot of that in those control sets where you're allowing somebody to set custom controls on each individual sharing request. It is an option that you have. If you've seen any of these demos, I don't know that I'm going to go too much onto the client side here today, but there's an information protection bar in the Office apps where it's sensitive, highly sensitive, and what have you. If I turn this on, it's going to pop up for them, thus giving them very plain visibility into what the classification level is set. Typically a recommendation, especially for doing automatic application or providing a requirement that you have to have everything labeled, right? We can do automatic labeling here. If we see attachments in here, we can do recommended approach, and then policy tips, right? Those are always ever so important as we look into applying these, letting the end users know that we're making changes here. So high level, pretty easy to go ahead and scope something, getting right in here. As you can see, by default, we have a global policy. This global policy is going to have the default names and recommendations that we have. Microsoft did a lot of research and worked with a lot of very, very large companies and organizations on how they handle information's rights and ultimately information protection, and came up with 5 common data types. There's obviously, as you can see, subtypes in here and changing permissions, but 5 main ones that are classified as kind of really becoming an industry standard of how we handle and understand information. And we use these internally. We have a couple extra permission controls, but this is what we use and a bunch of other institutions use as their 5 generic classifications. You can obviously go ahead and, if I really want to, I can start pulling these out. This gets into, again, the control here that we have of, if I want to publish additional ones to users, or, we have somebody working in, the engineering department or somebody in the finance department, you can give them the capability to have a label for credit card data or social security numbers. And we'll walk through that on the labeling side, but you do have the granularity. There's a capability there for you to go in and say, hey, this policy here applies to this group of users. And when they get this policy, they then have the permissions to do all of this. And if I classify it as confidential or highly confidential, I don't want them to be able to have the capability to have it unprotected. So, if I was to go ahead and click on this, save it out, I've then changed and modified it, as you can see here, that there is no control here for them to classify it and say, hey, there is no protection allowed. So, I mean, if I go back in here and add those back in, you can go in and now you can see that they've been added back through. Again, your similar ones here, something that's really good from a compliance standpoint. A lot of times when you start rolling these out to end users, they're like, why is it now all of a sudden I've got to apply this policy? Normally you have some sort of documentation or some sort of published compliance framework or terms of use and kind of that standpoint to give your end users. You just throw that URL in here, and then if they click the tell me more, it'll redirect them. So interesting little add-on component there. You don't have to put it in, but definitely recommend it as you're rolling it out, because you can kind of scare some people, I guess, you know, if all of a sudden you start classifying stuff as confidential or highly confidential based on the content that's in there. Yeah. And nothing. All right. So policies wise, or labels wise, as I said before, we have a few of them right here built in, your generic ones. We can go to confidential, highly confidential. We also have marking, so we're applying marks to anything that's confidential or highly confidential, as well as protection, right? So we're putting classification. Some of you may be familiar with the rights management service from Office 365 or Azure RMS. This is that next step, right? It's stacking on top of that, using those protection controls to apply labels based on the policies you define. So again, building on each other, kind of coming together. We have protection templates, so we can say it's customer ready or it's sensitive. We can publish those as well. But let's take a look at the credit card numbers and the social security numbers here, because these are some nice controls that we can leverage in the other products, right? So obviously I said credit card data. I can create a fancy color as far as what it looks like within the Office application when we classify information to it. So if I wanted to say, hey, the all ominous red color when something gets classified as it having credit card or sensitive information, we can handle that and we can do that. I want to protect. Here's what I would say. If any of you are familiar with the evolution of IRM into RMS and everything else, the encryption key is extremely important. Unless you have a crazy compelling reason to bring your own key for your own encryption protocols, and that really kind of, it's up to you to decide. I don't see a lot of people moving that route. You can definitely do that. When we manage the key, we auto roll it over. We handle all of that for you. So it becomes very, very easy for you to control and not have to worry about. There are, sure, if you go back in time, there's some horror stories you can find on the internet about people losing their information rights management key or failing to roll the certificate over properly and locking themselves out of their data. So use the cloud key, use the one that we fail over. We built the technology. We know how to roll those over correctly, so on and so forth. You guys get the hint. We can actually add additional permissions to the protection type. So I can say, hey, anybody that is a co-owner here has the ability to do everything. If I want to go ahead and say, hey, anybody that's a reviewer, these are the permissions they have. Or, if I want to do specific ones here, I can actually do that. One of the ones that we do see quite common, anything that's, using a macro, right? Let's, stop people from executing macros on protected content. We can do that. Document edit, everything like that. I can also scope the additional permissions, right? So if I had a security team here, they're allowed to be co-owners of any content that's created, so on and so forth. Not really that typical. It's up to you kind of on how you want to base that, but we could say all members get a custom permission. When we see that it is our credit card information, and they can view and open. And we'll block macros, but that's all they can really do. As soon as it gets classified as that, we're putting protection on it based on our tenant and saying, hey, that's what you get. You can view, open, and read, but as soon as we've classified that, it's stuck there. We can also go in here, which is another really powerful tool, and say, hey, we are never going to allow offline access, meaning that in order for them to open the content, to view the content, or manipulate it, they have to be on the internet and connected to the internet. Meaning I can't take a magical flash drive and bring it over and try and access the information, or I'm online, I leave, I go into a coffee shop, I haven't connected to the internet yet, but I have all this content open. It's going to make sure that you check in, or it checks into the information protection server to see that you're still authenticated, right? So. Other controls that we have here, visual markers, and this is where we talk about, marking. We can go ahead and put header text in here. We can actually put a footer text. And then a watermark. Interestingly enough, we used to do some watermarking stuff, where you would put it in, or it would be published as anything that gets classified as credit card data has the username of that data, or whoever opened it, sitting as a watermark to the back of that content or that file. Kind of cool, because that will help curb or help protect that information, as you know who leaked it when they take a snapshot of it with their cell phone of that fancy computer monitor, right? Again, we get down into here. I'll get into conditions in a second. Internal housekeeping notes. Hey, I created this for this person, blah, 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 so. Policy tips. Again, kind of getting back to that, what I was saying before, if we want to add a policy tip in here saying, we've detected that credit card data or information exists here. And so we applied it based on this. We can have automatic or recommended. This is that next level of we're automatically classifying it, or within that next level scanning engine that's built into the Office suite, we see that you've entered credit card information. And so we're going to recommend that you actually classify it yourself. There's other ways as we move down that chain and into other applications that we can reassess it or relook at it. And if you have this definition or this label saying if it contains credit card information, great, or it has a credit card number in it, great, we'll protect it on the back end, are additional controls that we can take advantage of. So let's look at conditions. This is our next control set. We can create custom, and I would strongly recommend looking at, we have regex, we have match with case sensitivity on and off. I know that historically a lot of people have emailed me being like, so I'm looking to do this, and I'm looking to use this regular expression in an exchange email, and wondering why, it doesn't actually care about case sensitivity, or it's only caring about case sensitivity in the Exchange Online side. This is why we have the recommendation to use the Azure Information Protection Engine, is we can look at a lot more controls like that. We care about case sensitivity. We care if it's a regular expression. We're looking at patterns here. If I want to just go back and use kind of our default occurrence controls, we have that. So we can go into financial. Obviously we can see there's a credit card here. We can put EU numbers in as well. And I can keep going. But you do have the capability yourself to create your own regular expressions, create your own exact data match phrases or controls that you're looking for, and create a label with automatic detection or a recommendation dependent on content creation, as that space. So the unique variable, kind of important, especially if we change the amount of occurrences. Maybe I don't care if there's one credit card in there, but if there's two or more, then I do. And you know what? I'm going to say it has to be two unique ones, right? So we have to say at least two, and then we'll classify that or allow us to apply that label creation. A minute. So one of the big controls, and I know the first 30 days is a huge component of that, is getting started tutorials, and the client itself. The client actually pulls all of these labels and policies that you actually have built in the cloud and allows you to do, and it's an on-prem scanner. So we can actually look at all the content sitting in an SMB share, sitting in a file server, and use the scanner to leverage your labels and your policies to detect what you have on-prem, right? And so the getting started tutorial here is fantastic. I'll click on that so you guys can see it. It'll walk you through all the individual controls, how all the policies work together, how they start. This is really a foundational building block as we get into further segments of understanding what we have as a data control set to, not only just doing DLP, but providing protection and actually, going in and pulling back information, right? So lots of information here. Really, really good to go through the tutorials. Strongly
hold on 1 second, Mike.
This video. Yeah.
One quick thing, just to call this out. I'm always harping on everybody to have pre-production tenants. This is exactly what you should be doing with your pre-production tenants. Watch this video, follow that tutorial, go through, click the buttons, understand it, make mistakes, roll it back, do that kind of stuff, right? Get in and touch it and feel it and play with it. Even if you're not thinking, hey, we're ready to deploy this in production today, because it's going to help you really figure this stuff out.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on with that, Preston. If you wanted to do it in your own tenant and you don't have one, you could create some labels that are not published in the default policy and create your own policies for a specific set of users. Not that I recommend doing that. I think the test tenant is far superior. What I would say is when it comes to the test tenant, it's very interesting as there's a strong relationship, especially on the Azure Information Protection with the auto classification with the Office suite that you're associated with. So if you download the Office bits from Office 365 from your production tenant, and that's where you're using it from, and that's what you're connected to on that device, they don't translate well to, hey, all of a sudden, it's going to look at that Office 365 tenant for its policies and its labels and not your test tenant. So there are some little caveats there with the test tenant environment as far as being able to detect policies, do the auto classification, your testing validation there. But if you have an extra machine or even a virtual machine, my colleague David Smoller has a virtual machine that's dedicated just to all these policies and everything else. So that when he opens the Office suite in that virtual machine, it's paired with your test tenant, and you can see the policies and the changes and that banner and that experience. So just be conscious of that. It's a great use case for using those test tenants. Just know that if you have those Office bits and you want to make sure that, hey, I changed this policy, why doesn't it show up? Or why can't I see the banner? I assign myself a policy in a test tenant. I'm signed in as that under another account, or I've connected my OneDrive to that. The AIP policies really only connect to the tenant that it was originally downloaded from, or that's the main sign-on account. The nodes here, this is another component of, as we go through the quick start, the client here for the scanner. Because it checks in, it automatically pulls the different classifications and policies. So that's a couple of little gotchas of we can see the computer, everything else. That being said, if you are going to start testing this, or you've got policies that you want to build and labels that you want to build, and you want to start, typically when I have this conversation, I know Preston can attest to this, but when we sit down and we talk and we start the crawl, walk, run, the crawl is simply going in here and taking labels like credit card information and social security numbers and scanning and looking for that information, right? As you can see, I'm not doing any marking or any protection here. I'm just simply looking for it. And that's that crawl, is the discovery phase, right? So we're looking for customer, content or documents either in a repository that are being created or being stored in the cloud that contain social security number. And when we see that, then we're going to go ahead and apply this label to it. We're not doing anything with that label today. It does give you a bunch of capabilities on the back end, right? So should I want to in the future go in and say, hey, now I want to apply protection to this, I can go in and configure this. And then it'll go back through. Or, hey, I've classified this as a social security number. oh no, I see that it's been shared out via OneDrive or via Box, and now I need to pull that back, or now I need to provide an incident notification or a notification of breach because that content has left my environment and it went to somebody it shouldn't have. There's a number of different labels or levels to the labels that you can go through and classify, understand, pull that information back, control it, transform it. But it all starts with building out these policies, and that's really that crawl step. The walk step is how we use these in further, further environments, or how we expand this into like the Security Compliance Center or Microsoft Cloud App Security, and where those move, which will be done in further conversations. But really important that you get started with looking at this, at least classifying and quantifying the information that you have. The on-prem scanner as well. We're not all in the cloud. I know a lot of people still have a ton of environments, home drives, all this other stuff. The only call out that I have for you with the scanner, and as you download that, if you're going to test and validate, don't put it on like your workstation and connect it to a SAN that has the SMB shared on it and say go to town. Make sure that it has decent network capabilities and decent IO, because it can be taxing, because when we pull the content over, it copies it to the scanner device, reads the content, assesses the actual document or accesses the individual file, applies a label to it, and then puts the label back on the original file content. So it does copy it off, look at it, and then put it back. So there is a decent back and forth there. So just understand that if you throw it on a workstation on a 10-100 LAN, it's not going to run the fastest versus having it sit kind of on a virtual machine or some dummy box that's adjacent or sitting in the data center and has a decent network IO to the shares that you're scanning. There are a few preview controls here. There's not a lot in here. We can look at workplace analytics and usage analytics here, activity logging, data discovery, and these are all in preview today. Configuring analytics here is one of those controls of understanding the data and connecting a workspace here of your log analytics to understand as content moves around in your topology and in your environment, what happens to it, who's connecting to it, who's looking at it. All of those are controls that are available in that preview state. Mine is already active, kind of in this last step. I skipped over it at the beginning just to kind of cover the main meat of the content. But protection activation, if this is set to inactive, the first thing you want to do before you start building any of this out is just click the activate button. I would caution, as we clearly do here, if you're going to deactivate stuff, you can lock some people out of their files, right? Similar to how I was talking about with the certificates. If you don't fail over the certificate correctly, then you're going to lock yourself out. If you deactivate this and you have a bunch of content that's created and classified, if you haven't unclassified it first, you can be risking some data loss here by simply saying, no, you can no longer contact that service and or that server that was giving me the thumbs up, thumbs down on whether or not you can actually access this content. So easy to turn on. The more you use it, the harder it is to turn off. And with that, I see that we're kind of right in a minute or two left, but that's the content. This is the getting started for it. So as I can honestly say this is probably one of the better tutorials, especially when he starts walking through the scanner. There's been some GUI enhancements to the scanner, I think, that are a little bit newer than what's in this YouTube video, but great content. The quick start tutorial is fantastic. It walks you through how to build all these controls and set them up, and a great way to get started in your demo environment.
Perfect. Thanks, Micah. One quick question for you here is, can we think of or throw out a couple of examples of where folks might get started with education-specific examples? I think Christopher Stanley had a great one in the IM window about just setting up maybe a staff-only label, right? Yeah. And then being able to attach a policy to that would allow everyone except students to be able to access that data.
Yep. You could modify the confidential and highly confidential. Actually, when I was demoing it, you could see like everybody or external. You could add another policy in there or create your own set to say, hey, this is only for employees, right? Or staff only can be scoped, you know, especially as you push this policy out to only your staff and faculty.
Right. So if you think about how that manifests itself for everybody, if you make that a policy under the confidential setting, for instance, so you have a confidential label, and then you attach that policy up underneath there, then what happens when you scope that is only staff see that, right? And it always shows up under confidential for them. So it when you scope this, it literally just hides it from people who aren't within scope of it. Trying to think of other things that would be really common for education. For instance, if you're looking to do something with automation or suggestion, just finding anything that contains excessive PII, perhaps social security numbers, is a good one, so that we don't accidentally send state reports to people we shouldn't, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about understanding, you know, structuring unstructured data, classifying information as and the content as it's being created. There's a lot of power there across a lot of different controls, and this is really a foundational block of that.
I'm going to stop the recording, but stick around and answer some more questions. I see Paul has one, so I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we will come back with some open Q&A. Thanks, guys.